Discretion is advised. This is 10-Minute Murder.
Westley Allan Dodd began sexually harassing the other kids in his neighborhood in 1974 when he himself was only 13 years old. At first, he was just exposing his genitals to them, causing them to feel uncomfortable and go and complain to his parents. Wesley's father, Jim Dodd, later admitted that he was aware of Wesley's harassment of the other kids, but he decided to ignore it. His reasoning was that apart from the indecent exposure, Wesley was, quote, a well-behaved child who never had problems with drugs, drinking, or smoking. So I guess let's just ignore the other deeply troubling and completely inappropriate behavior on Wesley's part, right? So Wesley never saw any consequences for his actions, and it allowed him to begin to escalate his crimes. By the time he was in high school, he had started to molest younger children. He began with his cousins and his father's girlfriend's young children, and then made an effort to advertise his babysitting services around the neighborhood. At his babysitting gigs, he would assault the children that he was paid to look after. Now, being a parent myself, I don't know how you can entrust Wesley with looking after your kids, knowing that he's the neighborhood flasher. So you have to think that these parents had no idea that this was the kind of kid they had looking after their children. When Wesley was 15 years old, somebody called the cops on him for exposing his genitals in public yet again. He was arrested, but then quickly released with a recommendation that he should attend some counseling sessions. And Wesley's crimes continued. He tried to kidnap 2 young girls a few years later, but the girls escaped and contacted the police. Once again, there were no legal consequences. A month later, Wesley joined the Navy and moved to Bangor Base in Washington, where he quickly began targeting the children whose families lived there. At one point, he tried to pay some young boys $50 to come up and play strip poker with him in a nearby motel room. And finally, his actions resulted in an arrest. But even though he told the officers that he had intended to molest the boys, the police decided to release him without filing charges. After he was caught once again after that, exposing himself to a child on the base, Wesley spent just under 3 weeks in jail and was ordered to attend counseling and was dishonorably discharged from the Navy. From his early teens, Wesley had stopped viewing young children as human. Instead, he viewed them as targets for his sexual perversions. His whole life revolved around hunting down his targets. He chose his jobs based on how easily he'd be able to gain the trust of children, and chose to move into a block of apartments because he knew that families with young kids lived there. He molested the toddlers of a family who lived next door, but after their family found out, she refused to press charges, believing that the process would only add to the victim's trauma. In 1987, 26-year-old Wesley approached a child and tried to convince the boy to follow him into an abandoned building nearby. Sensing that Wesley was not to be trusted, the boy said no, and he ran to the police. At this point, Wesley had a lengthy list of past sexual offenses, and the prosecution suggested a sentence of 5 years behind bars. But he was able to escape justice yet again, because while there was no doubt he'd intended to molest the boy, he had not actually committed a crime. The next year, Wesley's hunt for potential targets continued. He identified David Douglas Park in Vancouver as being an ideal spot for hunting. The park covered a large area, was full of dense woodland, and had a collection of isolated trails where he knew he wouldn't be interrupted while he was with his victims. Over the next 3 years, Wesley was arrested on multiple occasions. Each time, he served minimal time behind bars and attended court-ordered counseling sessions. One of the psychiatrists who examined him stated that he believed that the man was a sexual psychopath. By now, Westley Dodd had molested or exposed himself to an estimated 50 children. Most of them were male, several were toddler age, and every single one of them was less than 12 years old. With minimal repercussions, Westley began to consider escalating his crimes. He now didn't just want to molest and release his victims. He wanted to abduct and kill them. Quote, "The more I thought about it, the more exciting the idea of murder sounded. I planned many ways to kill a boy." On the 4th of September 1989, Westley went to his favorite hunting ground, David Douglas Park. He was armed with a knife, and he was determined to commit his first murder. Soon after, he met two boys, 11-year-old Cole Neer and his younger brother William. He convinced the two boys to follow him into an isolated trail. He then tied them both to a tree, took their clothes off, and sexually assaulted them. Once the assault was over, he used the knife to stab them to death and then ran away. Despite Westley's belief that the large park would allow a body to go undiscovered for some time, the boys were quickly found. Cole had already died from his wounds, and William was still alive, but passed away during the drive to the hospital. After killing Cole and William, Westley became obsessed with the murders. He kept a collection of newspaper articles about the case in his scrapbook. The following month, after traveling to Portland, Oregon, he killed again. While scoping out a small park, Westley saw 4-year-old Lee Isley playing on a slide, while his older brother Justin watched nearby. After Justin decided to walk back to the house, Westley told Lee that he would give him a ride home. Instead, he abducted Lee, driving him back to his Vancouver apartment, where he tied him to the bed and repeatedly molested him. He documented this abuse overnight, taking photos and writing diary entries about his crimes. When morning came, Westley was reluctant to kill the boy, but to prevent Lee from telling anyone about the crime, he ended up strangling him to death. Westley waited until November 1989 to strike again. This time, he traveled 12 miles east to a theater in Camas, Washington, where he saw a young boy, 6-year-old James Kirk II, in a public restroom. He tried to abduct James, but the boy attracted attention by kicking and screaming, and the employees came running. Westley attempted to carry the boy out to his car, but the employees followed behind him, so he put James down and fled the scene in his car. When James's mother's boyfriend, William Ray Graves, was informed that James had almost been kidnapped, he set off in pursuit, armed with only a description of the attacker. As luck would have it, Westley's car had actually broken down less than a mile away from the crime scene, and he was desperately trying to restart the engine. Ray didn't want to make the man suspicious, so he offered to help Westley with his car troubles. Then, as soon as Wesley's guard was down, he put him in a headlock and marched him back to the theater. The police were called to the theater and quickly realized that this man might be the killer they were looking for. After 3 days of interrogation, Westley broke and confessed to killing Lee, William, and Cole. A search of his apartment revealed a collection of newspaper clippings about the murders, as well as a photo album full of pictures of Lee being tortured, a detailed handwritten diary about the crimes, and what officers described as a homemade torture rack. Westley was charged with 3 counts of aggravated first-degree murder, as well as attempting to kidnap James Kirk. At his trial, quotes from his diary were read to the jury, alongside the photos he had taken. The evidence against Westley was gruesome and damning. It was clear that he'd taken great pleasure in his crimes, and that if he was ever released, he would not hesitate to continue. In 1990, Westley Allan Dodd was sentenced to death. He seemed to agree with the judge's verdict and refused to appeal his sentence, saying, quote, "I must be executed before I have an opportunity to escape or kill someone else. If I do escape, I promise you, I will kill and rape again, and I will enjoy every minute of it." Westley Dodd was executed by hanging on the 5th of January, 1993 at 12:05 a.m., while the family members of his 3 victims looked on. He was the first person to be hanged to death in the U.S. in almost 3 decades. and the American Civil Liberties Union tried to take legal action, claiming that execution by hanging violated the Eighth Amendment. However, the lawsuit did not change the outcome of Wesley's execution for one simple reason. Wesley had requested to be hanged to death so that he could die in the same way that Lee had. That is 10-Minute Murder for today. Brief and bingeable true crime. My name is Joe, I'm the host, and thank you for listening to today's episode. If you're new, welcome. Happy that you're here. Make sure you subscribe wherever you're listening to this right now, and you'll more easily be able to catch up on all the back episodes. Just open the app of wherever you're listening, and boom, 10-Minute Murder is going to be right there staring you in the face and welcoming you to listen to all of the back episodes. Connect with me on social media, see the pictures of what we talk about here in the podcast. It's never gross and graphic stuff, though. A quick email from one of you that listens. Hi, Joe. Marina from Tacoma here. Hope all is well. Really love your podcast. My husband Austin and I listen to your podcast on Spotify. Have you ever heard of Sylvia Likens? We just watched the movie based on her life in American Crime. It's bizarre. I also had a quick email question. If you had a chance to meet a serial killer in real life, who would it be? I ask because I just saw an episode of Piers Morgan interviewing Amber Wright. Happy Friday, Marina. And first of all, Marina, thank you so much for taking the time to reach out. And also thank you and your husband Austin for listening to the podcast. So first, Sylvia Likens. Yes, I've heard of that. I've seen that movie, and I've done an episode on it. Probably a couple of years ago, I did an episode on Sylvia Likens. Extremely disturbing case. So if you're listening to this now and you go back and you have no idea what the case is about, and you go back and find the episode, just know, as disturbing as today's episode was, it's even more disturbing than that. And secondly, if I had a chance to meet a serial killer in real life, who would it be? None of them. I just don't have the desire to meet or talk to them. To me, I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a profiler with the FBI. I don't have any valid questions to ask them. It would just be me insulting them, I guess, like calling them names, telling them how pathetic that would be the interview, is me asking zero questions, just telling them what I thought about them. And they would never agree to that, so what's the point? But I wouldn't want to sit down and ask them questions because that's been done by people that are qualified. I'm not qualified to do that. So it's already been done. I don't want to do that. I would be more interested in talking to and interviewing the people behind what put them behind bars, like the detectives, the forensic people, the criminal profilers. They're way more interesting to me than the actual killer themselves. Anyway, again, thank you, Marina, for listening, and thank you for your email. That's going to do it. That is 10-Minute Murder for today. Thank you so much for listening. And if you have a question, by the way, you can email me, joe@10minutemurder.com. Thank you for listening. Have a good night.